And there was given me a reed like unto a rod. And the angel stood saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein.
Good morning, welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. My name is Paul Strugini. It's good to be with you this morning. This is going to be a supplement to the Gospel of Matthew study. I almost put this as a separate study, as like a question, but it belongs in the study. We're going to look back at verse, and I don't know why I made this. Well, I can always do continue in Matthew on Saturday, so I don't know. I don't know if that disrupts anyone's schedule. I was trying to make it somewhat disruptive of mine. So I got a question from a listener a long-time listener on verse 16. Oops, let's see. I'm going to bring it up. I have removed all personal information from this message, and we're going to look at it and talk about it. Pardon me, I'm just trying to figure out. Okay, forgot that it does not automatically capture my window. There, now it should work. Yes, it's almost miraculous. Like the way it works, it's just bizarre to me. Okay. Hello, hi Paul, etc. I'm somewhat cautious of the way I've been interpreting Matthew 11:12. Wait a second. Why do I? No, I'm confused. Wait a second. Let me just. I must have copied that wrong. No, I wrote it down as 16. Alright, on the card it says 16, but actually it's 12. Okay, so I did it wrong. 11:12. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. And we did spend some time on this verse. Obviously, it's not obvious what that means. Like, blessed are the peacemakers. Though that is not always obvious either, if you think about it. And thinking about things is what complicates things sometimes. But sometimes that's the most essential thing we can do. So I'm not trying to argue with you. I understand that. But I'm trying to understand because I'm having a hard time getting past the way I've tended to look at this verse. Maybe you can help me. The first part of the verse says, from John the Baptist until now. Does that imply a stopping point or shift? Like how Christ is here. Now that Christ is here, things are going to be done differently. Well, the word until is interesting like that, and that it often does indicate a shift. Like, until the day Noah entered into the ark. In fact, I had I'm aware of this in the Bible many times, where it says, like, let's see, I had a bunch of verses here. Like 1 Corinthians 16:8, but I will, and sorry, this is not showing up on your thing, but it's not really intended to. In fact, I'll just move it out of the way so it's not distracting. But 1 Corinthians 16:8 says, but I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. But then again, on 2 Corinthians 3:14, but their minds were blinded until this day. Remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament. I mean, it was present at those times, and then to this very day, there remains the same veil untaken away. So until is entirely context dependent. I mean, it is not a it's an indicator of something having continued in the past up to this moment, but does not explicitly indicate a cessation or a change. It is merely referring that something has been ongoing. So there's no way to tell outside of looking at it in context. And Yeah, I mean, you could take it, like I said, there are many ways you can interpret verses, but there's only going to be a couple viable interpretations, and you can explore an idea a little bit and sort of rule it out. And, the most important thing we do is analyze a verse in context with all the other verses, and then see if we can't rule out our interpretation. Sometimes it's not so easy to find the right interpretation as it is to come up with, or at least to peg certain interpretations as, no, that can't be right. So, yeah. And here, let's just go on to this, to the continuing the question. So the answer to that question is, does it imply a stopping point? No. Though it might. You know what I mean? We'd have to look at, we'd have to say, we'd first have to find out what it means, and then analyze if that's an ongoing problem or condition, let's say. It's not a problem, because we'll be neutral about it. Is it an ongoing condition, or is it something that is that was cured, let's say, by Jesus? He cured the problem. It was a problem going on then, and I already read your letter, of course, and so from my perspective, if your interpretation is correct, it's an ongoing affair, so it's not something that stopped. And I don't. It doesn't have the flavor of something that stopped. So I think what he means is this until is that it's an ongoing affair until to this very day. That's sort of what it means. Is like right up to this moment, this is going on. It's an interesting word, but it can have that like. Keep driving until you get to the lights. From then until now, he's been punching me in the face. I don't know why I picked that. but I was like, that does not imply that it has stopped. Though sometimes it strongly implies a stop, a change, a big, I mean, I didn't go through all the verses. Like the 2 Corinthians 3:14. I just looked at the first two that came up in my search. Galatians 4:2, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. And a lot of them are that moment of ending, like, my little children of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you, which is our earnest inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession. But then there's, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now. And it does not, or for your fellowship, like, and always in every prayer of mine, this is Philippians 1:4, always in every prayer of mine, for you all making request with joy for your friendship in the gospel from the very first day until now. No, he doesn't say it like that. He's being confident in this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you, he's not saying you stop being my friend. And if you, here you go. Here's another one. 1 Timothy 6:14. That thou keep this commandment without spot, unrebukable, until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ, in which case you can just throw off all restraint. So it's definitely, there's definitely, the only way you can tell is by reading it, and then in the context it has to be determined. So it would depend on whether we think this is a situation that has come to an end. Yeah, I don't need to beat that to death. All right, we're going to look at the listeners. I said listener. I guess I don't know. Like I said. Before Christ, the kingdom of heaven has patiently endured the violent who take the kingdom by force. That force is by law that kills. After Christ, you cannot simply take the kingdom by force using law. It must be given to you by the Spirit. Maybe you can see why I'm having trouble there. Yeah, I see the point. First of all, there's two things in this verse, in verse 12. The kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and it's taken by violence. Now, that is an interesting thing, because you think about it, okay. And it's interesting also that the word until has that dual nature that can only be determined by the context. And I see this verse in that light too. And I'll give you a little more, because this was asked, I gave more thought about it. And it's because I realized that when I was taking both interpretations of the verse, that, there are two things. It has violence done unto it, and it's taken by violence. There's violence, but it is, and I don't think, I wonder if those two things, those two ideas might not be two separate things engaged in by two groups of people. Whereas you could have something like, let's I want to look at before I go into that, I'm going to read the rest of your question here. I have even quoted the scripture as a way to draw attention to legalism, which we cannot take the kingdom of heaven by legalistic obedience. This bloody way kills and destroys. See, you can't take it by force, but you can cause it to suffer by force, or you can cause it to, you can commit force against it. There's no life in it. You cannot go in this way. Sorry. You can only go in by the Spirit, which does have a kind of force. Yeah. The violent means of law take the kingdom by force. However, they also will not prevail. In Christ, we will take the kingdom back, and we also use force, but a different kind of force, a righteous force. I like the idea of being serious about the kingdom and taking it like Caleb and Joshua. Let's take the kingdom. God has said this is delivered unto us. You mentioned Abraham. I've had thoughts about this. Taking the kingdom by force is like Ishmael, who was given by force, whereas Isaac was the son of the promise. It's like the old covenant and new covenant, one by man's ability, the other by God's ability. But even, in the old covenant, Abraham was forceful enough in his obedience to God that he was willing to offer up Isaac. I wrote something about that. If you have time, I'm sorry. I looked at it briefly. I didn't put the link in here to kindlingtruth.com. I think that's the right address. I wasn't sure if I should show that link in the thing. I don't know. I do think the legalism, or maybe fundamentalism, also is the interpretation for this verse. Ooh, is the interpretation? Well, you have to eliminate all the other interpretations first. And if so, and then there's nothing wrong with favoring an interpretation. If so, much can be said about what it means for Christianity today. Maybe you disagree. I want you to persuade me if you do, please. Okay. I want to be sure to clear on this, this verse. Yeah, it is. Yeah, using it. Well, look at. I resist mostly the thing that says legalism is the interpretation. It is certainly a forceful way that people try to interact with God. They try to say, well, hey, this is what the letter of the law says, and if I follow this, then God is obligated. And there are all kinds of ways. Instead of getting specific about that, I'm going to put the verse back up. Sorry, I have a lot of... I'm going to have to clear my throat a few more times. Okay. Alright. I had it like a second ago. There we go. First of all, the king, John the Baptist, from the way Jesus is looking at it, this has been going on from the days of John the Baptist to his own time, and not because I think the behavior of men has been different, because John the Baptist signals the beginning of the proclamation of the kingdom of heaven, meaning that he was the forerunner of Messiah. So even though the Old Testament prophets prophesied of Messiah, they would not be considered part of this sort of kingdom dynamic that was being preached in the days of Jesus to this very day. So I do think it's an ongoing thing, even now, like from the days of John the Baptist until now. The kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. Like I said, I do not like the idea of saying that it can be taken by force by people doing it unrighteously. Like, if I were to follow a legalistic pursuit of, salvation, I can't actually take the kingdom. I can't enter in that way, as you said yourself. So I can't enter in by force. Not that way. You know what I mean? Like, I can't forcefully, by my own rules, so to speak, or by taking God's rules and sort of combine them into some sort of systematic motions I can go through. I cannot force my way into God's kingdom. I cannot force my way into God's will. I need God to take me in. So I cannot, through the wrong means, force my way in. But, so what I'm doing when I pursue legalism or fundamentalism or the other, or something, let's say some third thing, I'm not going to come up with anything, some third thing, like, gosh, why? I guess those are the main enemies right now, I think, as far as of the gospel. But whatever. If I try to go about doing it legalistically, what I'm doing is I'm doing violence to the kingdom. I'm defaming the kingdom. When I say, like, well, you got to do this, you got to do that. The kingdom of God was preached according to Jesus' preaching, and then I start preaching some other gospel, some other way. And I'm doing violence against his kingdom is what I'm doing. I am an enemy of God's kingdom. I am breaking it up. I'm trying to, I'm not actually destroying it, but I am committing a violent act against it. I am subjecting the kingdom of God to my violent action. When I preach another gospel, when I preach legalism, when I when I take like I said, it's like the kingdom of heaven suffers because of fundamentalism, because it destroys people's faith, literally, because of you take the Bible literally, all you gotta do is have someone come along and start making you stick to that, and it's gonna erode your faith. And because they'll show you all your inconsistencies. Because you can't take it literally all the time. There's no way. You can't. And the Bible never says just take everything literally all the time. And like I said, they themselves, that's why the fundamentalism is more of a favoring of the literal. Because none of them, I know they would not say, we don't take everything literal, Paul. But some people think you do. I've met people who think you do. It's like the parables were all literally true of a literal, like all of them. They were literally true. In every detail, that was precisely what Jesus wasn't telling, just making up a story. He was actually recounting events in every single parable. What they'll say is, they'll say, the people who are not that extreme will say things like, they'll deny that the parable of Lazarus and the rich man is a parable. So this is not a parable, because unlike a parable, blah, 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 that reasons. So you have the kingdom of heaven having violence done to it. It is is being subjected to violence. That is something we never want to do. But on the other hand, taking the kingdom by violence is like that other side of it, which you were aware of from my interpretation of that verse a couple days ago. Abraham being willing to sacrifice his own son or to leave his country. These are very forceful actions which allowed him to obtain the promise. You think about all the things done by faith that are recounted, like in Hebrews, that the women receive their children back from the dead. They obtained promises. They won battles. They did all kinds of things through being forceful in their faith. And Jesus himself, in his example of his forceful testimony against the Pharisees, or in his time, and all the things he did which were forceful. Like I said, violence is, again, it means to be, to use force, to actually, to take action, not be passive. I mean, essentially, like if I was gonna, I think I covered that the other day. So we can simultaneously have both interpretations. They both might be true. There might be two things here, and not just one thing. Meaning people doing violence and taking the kingdom. Like doing violence to the kingdom and taking the kingdom. Though that does, that view. The problem is that's how it sounds. He's talking. But that is simultaneously the most difficult interpretation to work with, because if I say that, well, the kingdom can be taken by force, like you can literally just go to heaven however you please, like you can actually legitimately enter into God's kingdom or take it, capture it. You can do that through power of force. And that, even though that seems to be like how it sounds when it hits your ears, it seems like that can't be right. The forceful seize it. And they seize the kingdom for themselves. So if you do interpret it all as one thing, you have to sort of say, like, well, they don't really take it. They just kind of seem in the world like they've sort of taken it over, right? You look around and you see a lot of people who have, I was saying it's funny. It's like they'll be like, well, by what authority do you teach? Well, this guy's been ordained by this massive organization. And, where did they get their authority? At some point, Luther was an outlaw, for his Lutheran church. He was rebelling against the church. But somehow the authority he had been given under the church somehow transferred to when he left the church. And so then he could, all these organizations are self-appointed. I mean, you can kind of go back in a sort of chain of custody to the apostles. But, I'm sorry, I need a haircut. Oh, sorry, Katie. It should have been yesterday, right? There's a sort of chain of custody. We can all trace ourselves back to the apostles, ultimately. But as far as every time someone handed authority to someone, was that legitimate? Does that go back? Like, so my authority I give to you, I give to you, I give to you, I give to you. At some point, did they ever give it to somebody they shouldn't have given it to? And did he give it to someone he was supposed to? I don't know how to trace that stuff. And the Apostle Paul, right away in the book of Acts, you have the Apostle Paul step in, who was not, he was, you think about that. He was not one of the 12. As he said of himself, I was as one born out of season. I was born at the wrong time. I didn't come into this. He came into this after Jesus had died and rose from the dead. So he was definitely a latecomer, and he did not consult with the apostles. He did not go up to them and seek authority from them. So right there, he immediately overthrows any notion of apostolic succession. Because he was appointed directly by God. If Paul was appointed directly by God, I can be appointed directly by God. And that is kind of where the Protestant Reformation sort of, every man as a priest gets off and saying that, like, hey, we can get our authority directly from God. Of course, that means that anyone can be self-appointed, but they're all self-appointed. That's the point, is that everyone after the 12 apostles was self-appointed. I mean, we're sort of trusting. If we believe someone has authority from God, there's an element of trust going on, and there's certainly an element of judgment we ought to be exercising. Just because someone stands up there in their three-piece suit and they have, shiny gold rings on, and people are sending them tons of money, it does not mean that they are someone whom God has invested with any authority at all to say anything about anything. And like I said, to me, authority is measured by, there's a lot of things that convey authority, but you have to be first speaking with authority to have to need it. I don't sit here to speak authoritatively, like I'll tell you the answer to this question based on the authority vested in me. The answer to the question, this is answering the question based on a teacher's thought process of how the question gets answered. And so, so the kingdom of heaven suffers violence and is taken by violence is not necessarily referring to the same thing. So you can have people, it all depending on, do you take the first part, and how, let's say how literally you take the first and second part. Because if I look at it as the kingdom of heaven endures violence, but and like I said, it suffereth violence is one word in Greek, so it's just like it has violence being done to it. It is the object of violence. The kingdom, violence is done to the kingdom. Do we have I'm trying to think if there's a word that would encapsulate that, like in a single word. The kingdom of heaven, violence is done to the kingdom. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's a better way to express it in a single word. Again, and the violence sees it. That is the most pared down version, or the forceful sees it. The forceful sees it. I mean, sees, not sees. Suddenly I heard it the way I said it, and I thought, okay, that's not right. Okay, so do I have anything more to say about that? Yeah, that's basically all I can say. There are forceful ways to seize the kingdom and to legitimately take hold of it. Like I said, give me the little book. Take it. Eat it up. Gobble it up. Be forceful about this. And other ways. I mean, when someone wants to receive the Holy Spirit, well, pray about it. Like the widow woman and the unjust judge. He feared neither God nor men, but she was so forceful that he gave her what she wanted. She forced the issue. Violence, and I did not research this word, and if you want to, and you could tell me if you find anything that's worth changing the interpretation. But I do not know that it explicitly refers to physical violence. But even if it does, that could be by way of analogy, referring to, other kinds of, just like force. If I say I'm gonna force something, I don't have to use physical force to force the issue. Like, I'm gonna force you to talk about this. I mean, if you literally want to run away, I may have to physically restrain that person. But, you know, I mean, I can also force it just by insisting. That's why the widow woman was forceful. And I don't know that it necessarily... I don't know that our word of violence... If I say violence, you're thinking physical violence. Like, the idea of verbal violence is a little bit... It's actually something that's sort of in the... Not in the news exactly, but in the spirit of our times, there's an idea about physical violence because they're trying to say freedom of speech is a form of violence. And it is. It is a form of violence, but it's a legitimate form of violence. Like violent speech. Not speech which incites to violence, but speech which is forceful. You know what I mean? Which is, which is powerful. Which is, which alters people's perspective. That is dangerous and powerful and it's in its manner a form of violence. But it is the most legitimate form of violence known to man. It is the violence, I want to look up a verse. I just feel like, okay. I'm going to look up the word lips. Okay, that's good. Alright, let's see here. Only 113 references to lips in the Bible. Maybe that was too much. More verses than I cared. I know where I want it from, though. I want to... Most of these are Proverbs. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Isaiah 30:27. Behold, the name of the Lord cometh from far, burning with his anger, and the burden thereof is heavy. His lips are full of indignation, and his tongue as a devouring fire. And his breath as an overflowing stream shall reach to the midst of the neck, to sift the nations with the sieve of vanity. And there shall be a bridle in the jaws of the people, causing them to err. I just like that his lips are full of indignation. It's a very forceful image of God, as his speech itself. His tongue is as a devouring fire. It is this violent thing. To be able to speak with fire. I mean, or even like, last week when I was doing my my live stream about, family and patriarchy. I should have made it patriarchy from the beginning, because if I want clicks, that's a word to throw in there. So, I demonstrated like a form of masculine, people don't like when you get indignant or when you start speaking like roughly. It's like, well, it's like, because they feel there is a sort of a violent thing to it. It unsettles people. It makes them fearful. It makes, people value someone always remaining calm. But like there are times when if you remain calm, people are going to think you're actually indifferent. If you don't actually display the emotion appropriate to the situation. If they need to be able to understand that physical violence is where we go after this. If, if you can't, I don't like people who they keep it quiet and then they quietly slit your throat. It is good to give off a signal of like, this is escalating, and to a level where it is, and I'm not saying you should go out and commit violence, but there's a time for everything. I always think that's funny, it's like, there's a time for every purpose under heaven. Jesus certainly doesn't call us to violence, but I'm saying there is cause for violence in the world. You bet. And there's violence to take the kingdom. And then, like I said, it's I think on reconsideration, I don't see how my forceful desire for God's kingdom is a form of violence against the kingdom. You know what I mean? Like, am I doing violence to the kingdom? Or, you know what I mean? Am I making the kingdom of heaven subject to my violent behavior? I don't think so. I have trouble seeing it that way. So, because of the in this whole thing, when you interpret it, I just really have my other ear in. There we go. That's better. This whole thing, when you interpret it, you have to think about the nature of the kingdom of heaven. Like, what is the kingdom of heaven? Is it, you know what I mean? Like, is it something that someone could just take by force? Well, in some sense, no. But Jesus says, in some sense, yes. And it suffers violence, and the violent take it. And just before we conclude that, just and I just want to look at my context again. And I'm not going to necessarily make this an hour. I'm just going to wrap this up real soon here. No, that's not to say it couldn't go an hour. And you know what, let me just check the chat too. Oh, I have some chat. Gotta pop it out. And I also want to get away from here before it starts going live. I do not want to watch the stream. It's like Ghostbusters. Do not cross the streams. And I do not want to see the stream while I'm doing it. That is highly undesirable. Though I can see it on my screen, I don't want to actually see it live because I feel like it affects the quality. Or I'm superstitious that it might affect the quality. So I got some comments here from All-Star Comments or Katie Stringini. Seems more like a situation caused by John the Prophet. His preaching was causing a disruption, a strong disturbance. The weak hypocrites were like the chaff to John. John forcefully John was a forceful preacher. But they also forcefully opposed him, right? They resisted him. If from the days of John the Baptist, not from Abraham. Well, yeah. Well, what I'm saying is, there are just examples in the Old Testament of people being forceful to obtain from God. Now, Jesus is saying, what Jesus is saying of the kingdom obviously only applies, like I said, from the days of John the Baptist until now, in the days of the kingdom. But the notion that God's kingdom might be taken by force, or that it might have force put upon it. You could say the covenant of Abraham, before John, the covenant of Abraham was suffering violence and was being taken by violence. You know what I'm saying? Like, it would. That's why I said this hinges on the idea of the kingdom, because the kingdom is the thing being considered. So you can have a similar situation ongoing from the time of Abraham, from the time of John the Baptist, or from all times. You can have this idea of suffering violence and doing violence. This is an ongoing affair throughout human history in some sense, but it is only applied to the kingdom from the time of John the Baptist until now. That's why I said it is an important consideration that, I can suffer violence and be taken by violence, right? My home can suffer violence and be taken by violence. But but this verse refers to the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven specifically. I'm on the wrong. I was in 12:11 because I have some sort of dyslexia. I was never had it in my youth. Let me just say it's a product of age. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the king. Okay, all the prophets prophesied until John. He is Elias. Yeah. In the end, as you know, I go over all these interpretations, and it's like, you know, I can't definitively say what I think about it. It's not obvious to me. It's still a bit of an enigma. I would hesitate to say, oh, any interpretation is the interpretation, especially something so specific as legalism, because that's pretty specific. There are a lot of ways that people could be. I mean, that's certainly an interpretation. I have no problem with that. As far as the enemies of the gospel are, in many ways, there's the legalism, the Judaism of Paul's day, and the Judaizers trying to get people to become Jews in order to be Christians. That is certainly, and also that was something John the Baptist was going up against in his preaching, because he was baptizing. He was this lone prophet in the wilderness. As you know, and I can't help but draw on the Old Testament analogies, like Elijah himself, who was at the same time. I mean, think about this. Elijah was subject to the violence of his enemies. He was hiding in a cave. Lord, they have killed thy prophets and digged down thy altars, and I am alone left. And the Lord said, I have reserved to me 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. But in a great nation, that's not a lot of people. A nation of millions, 7,000 is a very small proportion. I don't know what the population of Israel was at the time, but this is during their kingdom period before the depopulation of the Syrian and the king of Babylon. So Elijah there was suffering violence. You know, the prophets were being killed, the altars were being digged down, and he wasn't alone, but he felt alone. So the kingdom, not the kingdom in that case, it was not the kingdom, but it was sort of like God's people, the covenant, the prophet, who Elijah is right in the midst of this. So this is, I think, a fair thing to talk about. But then he went out, Elijah. He's hiding from the persecution, but then he goes forth and ends up overturning the order with Ahab and Jezebel. Those who sought to destroy him were ultimately destroyed. He went forth and he prayed to God, and God sent down fire out of heaven to light up the sacrifice, which was soaked in water. A very forceful act. He anointed Jehu to be king, and who slew Ahab. Elijah lived in very violent times. And John also, you know, he was forceful in his preaching, and the men who were against him were also forceful. There was a reason he was out in he had to be out in the wilderness doing this, because the centers of power, if he was doing it in Jerusalem, he could get, probably it would not be convenient. You know, there's a reason sometimes you have to go away from everything to get away with things. You have to go away to get away. Because otherwise they'll be on top of you. Now, Jesus starts preaching I was going to say this, but like out in Galilee and stuff. He does not start by going right to Jerusalem. You know, he doesn't start his ministry preaching in the streets of the capital. He's off in these smaller cities. I mean, they're still cities, but they're not at the center of their life, at the center of the Jewish life in Jerusalem. He's preaching on a mountain. John is baptizing in the wilderness by the river Jordan. That way the people who are powerful at the center of things have to come out to be able to deal with him. And then they're in his element, and they are more subject to his. You know, he can be, who has warned you to flee from the wrath to come? You serpents, you offspring of serpents. So, yeah, the kingdom of heaven is a thing that starts from the days of John the Baptist, no doubt. And so that part is the scope, because the kingdom can't suffer violence before that, but other things suffer violence and are taken by violence. I mean, manifestly. But I think what Jesus is saying is the kingdom of heaven is unlike other things. Or I guess when I interpret this verse, I take it like unlike other things. Because unlike other things, those who do violence to the kingdom, those who harm God's kingdom, will never obtain it. You know what I mean? Normally, when one does violence, one takes by violence. Like a city, of course, right? In the ancient times, they would come and they would lay siege to it and they'd take it. And when Jesus says the same thing about the kingdom, okay, does he mean the kingdom of heaven is like everything else? It can be forcefully, it can be taken by force. You can just come in and do violence to it and take it away. And sometimes it definitely feels like that. I mean, in the world, men are, they come in with their false doctrines, with their teachings, and they sort of like go turn on a TV, turn it on a TBN or whatever, or what, and watch the preaching there, and you'll see people who are full of force, and they have staked out a position in the kingdom, so to speak. At least that is their claim. Jesus, right? And certainly in the kingdom as it is presented outwardly in the world, they seem to have taken it. But they're not legitimate. And when the Son of Man has come in his kingdom, I refer to it often, of course, and everyone is familiar with this, but I'm going to bring it up for anyone new who will look at this in the future. I'm looking up the word wedding garment. And we'll be covering this in Matthew. Okay. Matthew 22:11. Matthew 22, verse 1. And Jesus answered and spake unto them again by parables, and said, The kingdom of heaven is like unto a certain king, which made a marriage for his son. This is what the kingdom of heaven is like. And sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding, and they would not come. Again he sent forth other servants, saying, Tell them which are bidden, Behold, I have prepared my dinner, and my oxen and my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready. Come to the marriage. But they made light of it, and went their ways, one to his farm, another to his merchandise. The remnant took his servants, and entreated them spitefully, and slew them. But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies, and destroyed those murderers, and burnt up their city. Then said he to his servants, The wedding is ready, but they which were bidden were not worthy. Go ye therefore to the highways, and as many as ye shall find, bid to the marriage. So there, at the beginning, you see a sort of violence being done to the kingdom, right? I mean, John the Baptist was beheaded. He is the kingdom of heaven coming. He is the forerunner of Christ. Repent for the king. He was saying, he that is coming after me is the king, and he was the beginning of God's kingdom is John the Baptist. And violence was done to him. They were unworthy. They made light of it. That was, making light of it But I mean, he literally includes in verse 6, the remnant took his servants and entreated them spitefully and slew them. There's your violence. They've done violence to the kingdom of heaven. In verse 9, he says, the king says, go ye therefore to the highways, and as many as ye shall find, bid them to the marriage. And those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all, as many as they found, both bad and good, and the wedding was furnished with guests. So the gospel goes out, come. And when the king came in to see his guests, he saw that there was a man which had not on a wedding garment. And he said unto him, friend, how camest thou hither not having a wedding garment? Then said the king to the servants, bind him hand and foot, and take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. You can't take the kingdom by force. You can't just come in any way you like. You can't just enter into this kingdom however you please. You can't entreat the servants of God spitefully. You can't do violence to them. As I'm saying, the kingdom of heaven is unlike any other kingdom because it is just. Men cannot take it by force. They can do violence to it. They can kill God's servants. They can do all kinds of things and seem to be harming it, but they cannot obtain it. And the only way to obtain it by force, and that's what makes this verse in Matthew have that dual meaning, is that the only ones who can take it by force are those who have who give a care enough to put their wedding garments on and to prepare to, like, I've been bidden to a wedding. I'm going to a wedding today, so I'm going to put on clothing. I'm not going to come in wearing this. You know, I'm just wearing a t-shirt and a sweat jacket. I'm not going to show up at the wedding not having on clothing appropriate to the wedding. I'm going to expend some energy. I'm going to wash my hair. I'm going to brush my teeth and shave again. Oh, I haven't shaved since yesterday. And I'm going to show up with, having exercised some power to get ready for it. And I think this parable actually is a great example where you see people trying to take it by force, and then some, meaning this is our opinion of your little old preaching. They make light of it. They kill his servants. They're causing the kingdom to suffer violence. And at the same time, there are those who are, and this is the behavior of the unworthy. The unworthy do violence to God's kingdom, and then they will try to also co-opt the kingdom, but they ultimately fail. But the weird thing is that in this verse, Jesus indicates like, oh, well, they succeed. Is that what he meant? I think that interpretation that this verse has one or the other meaning is just about ruled out. Like, I don't see how you can say this is one thing. And like I say, unless you spiritualize, or not spiritualize, unless you sort of make it a caveat. Well, they seem to take the kingdom. Yeah, like you look on the TV and look at, they're taking the kingdom, but they haven't taken anything. Like, they're standing there in their $1,000 suits, flying around in their private jets, but they're going to be in God's kingdom. Like, if you could see the way things really stand, they're just sitting there in the midst of God's feast without a wedding garment on. You know what I mean? They're sitting there in street clothes. They've entered into God's kingdom in street clothes, with mustard and ketchup dribbled down their chin, and they've got, they pissed themselves. As far as that's like the stench that comes off of them. Their garments are filthy, and they have not obtained the kingdom. They're just doing violence to it with their sick example. So that's the only way you could say someone through legalism or through fraud or whatever means you want to say, whatever violent, because there's a dual nature of force. There's sort of lawful force and there's unlawful force. There are those who are worthy of the kingdom, and if you're worthy of the kingdom, you are called to take hold of it. Get dressed. You know what I mean? Get dressed. Be forceful in your attempts to lay hold on God's promises, because that is worthy. There's a worthy violence and there's an unworthy violence. Those that are not worthy will not inherit the kingdom, no matter how violent they are. You can't just walk into God's kingdom any way you please. You know, the king took obvious offense in Matthew 22 when someone showed up to his kingdom thinking they could just walk in like that. You think you can be here? You know, those who were unworthy in the world were slain, and you come into my house like this and you think you will do better with your unworthy behavior? You killed my servants. You know, I mean, they killed his servants, and he returned and killed them and burned down their city. And that happened to Jerusalem. So, I think they beat that to death. And look at it, I did make it to an hour, or nearly. We're at 55 minutes. Should I end 5 minutes early? I never put up... Let's check the... let's see if Katie has anything more to say, because Katie's always full of interesting things to say. And, no, she doesn't. And I shouldn't pick my teeth on camera. I don't even need it. I just get... Alright, let's close that down. Let's do this. We haven't done this at all. Subscribe to Line by Line Bible Studies. Click on the like button. Click on the like button. Do it. I dare you. It's right there. Just click on it. And I can't see if anyone's actually doing it. I could see, but I don't know if I could see, actually. I've never actually tested that thought. All right, oraclesofgod.org. That's what my website is. That's since 1998, about, I think. I say that because that's when my first album came out, and that's why I started the website. Actually refers to my music. Not my music group, because there's no group. It refers to the music itself. So some people don't understand. Oracles of God is not like I'm saying I'm an oracle of God. What it's saying is these words are the oracles of God. And, you know. And this question is brought to you by questions@oraclesofgod.org, because a frequent listener had a question and they sent it to me, and it was about Matthew, so we want to cover those as quickly as possible. I have another question that has to do with something I did, something in Titus, the Iron Man question, but the thing is, I've got to go back and figure out what I said about it, because I read the question, I'm like, what did I say? So it's sort of like, I'd actually be revisiting the question anew, which is fine, and which I will do, but I kind of want to go back and figure out what I said. And I realize I'm not on camera. Okay. Anyways, that'll do. We can end a few minutes early. I have nothing more to say on this subject as far as... No, that's not true, actually. I have another 5 or 6 hours of things I could say on this subject, and maybe even more than that. Oh, there's plenty to be said about it. But like I said, I think that's a more refined view of my interpretation, which I will probably promptly walk away from the study forgetting exactly how I did this, and how every time everything is reconstructed from scratch. That's how I do not have a very good well, I have a very strange memory. Not very strange. It's just that's how my memory works. It's like I remember things sort of. I mostly reconstruct it all live. It's all reconstructed right here, right now in my mind. It's like every time I go at it, it's like all my combined experiences are in like this mass of thought, and then I have to go out and pluck them out, because it's like I just think that what I would say is my memory is not terribly well organized, and I don't think that can be fixed. So whatever. I won't forget it, but it's as far as I'm concerned, it's like, well, I think next time I see this verse, I'll remember that I felt that it was both. I sure hope I do. I hope you remember. But here's the thing: is like it's not so much important to remember how this verse or that verse is interpreted. If we have the right understanding of the truth, I mean, which is much greater than any verse. Like just the knowledge that's like I can't just take God's kingdom. Like I'm taking the truth that the Spirit of God has given me, and then just applying that knowledge to the verse faithfully. Not, you don't want to like take a thought you have and then just run with it without saying, well, can I rule that out? Let's look at it both ways. Let's look at it each way and see. I look like a crazy man today, don't I? Or maybe that's every day. Boy. Anyways, so you got to take it into consideration. I have 3 seconds. I made it to an hour. All right, that's it. No more talking. We're done. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to joining you, staying with you again. Yeah, there we go. Let's pick a song. Yeah.
He that hath my word, let him speak my word faithfully. What is the chaff to the wheat, saith the Lord? It's not my word, like as a fire and like a hammer that breaketh the rock in pieces, saith the Lord. Therefore behold, I am against the prophets.